there has been a lot of overseas banking community visit Vietnam recently. And I cannot tell
Yeah.
exactly who, but they all agree that this is the best time to invest in Vietnam. Because all the monopoly power is
Yeah.
technically gone and the whole system is being cleaned up and valuation is more attractive than ever. So this foreign community, they have so much cash and they want
Yeah.
to build a bigger presence in Vietnam.
Right.
So they're all very excited.
Interesting.
And it's not just banking that they want to buy and invest.
Yeah.
They want to do electric vehicle, food and beverage, manufacturing.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
Evo Commerce sells premium affordable supplements and personal care electronics, operating in Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. Strive brand sells salon-grade quality products for home use and using direct-to-consumer channels through its online retail channels and physical shops. BBAC is the leader in hangover remedies in over 2,000 retail outlets across the region. Learn more at bbac.co and stryv.co.
Hey, good morning.
Hi, Jeremy.
Good to have you in person again.
Yeah, happy to be back here again.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting contrast between when we do it online versus doing it in person.
Yeah, not much contrast.
Not much
to be honest.
contrast to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mix it up for people who are listening in, I guess. So I guess we want to talk about the big news, which is this month, which was a crazy year because you had Xi Jinping come to Vietnam, you had Biden come to Vietnam, and now you have Putin.
Yeah, I think Vietnam is the only country in the world that welcomed 3 presidents of China, US, and Russia visit in less than a year, probably less than 6 months. All
Yeah.
3 of them visited.
Wow.
So last week, Putin and his government, including Ministry of Trade, Finance, so Putin brought a big entourage to Vietnam and we hosted them. We had a big ceremony to host them, being our new president. So it was a big headline. Some not so positive about the news and some like, this is Vietnam doing the right thing. So a lot of people ask me about this visit, actually. They're very confused.
Why are they confused?
Yeah, because like I mentioned, no country in the past year hosted 3 presidents at the same time. So they don't know where Vietnam stands. US has expressed some disappointment that we hosted Putin and his delegate, but essentially we have no choice. Our foreign policy strategy is more like bamboo strategy, meaning we are very flexible, but we have strong, resilient. That's a bamboo analogy coming from.
Yep.
We have to welcome all 3 parties because all 3 are very important strategically, politically, and logically, also military-wise, very important for us. If in the past, Russia was the largest and still the largest weapons supplier and exporter to Vietnam. That's why we have to welcome and greet Putin and his delegate, but as I mentioned, the US government expressed some disappointment, and some of the business communities, investors, have expressed to me that if this visit result in further trade agreement between Vietnam and Russia, then it might cause a lot of stop in foreign direct investment from US, which is increasing over the year.
I think definitely interesting because, I'm a history buff and, the US-Vietnam War, the biggest supplier was Russia during that time frame as well. So there's a lot of, obviously, arms industry links even today, like you said, number one supplier of armaments today to Vietnam. And also during the Vietnam-China War, Russia was supporting Vietnam during that time frame, which happened after the Vietnam-US War. So I think it's quite understandable that the political elite, I would say, who have been around since that time, should still have those connections with the Russian government.
Yeah. So back in that time, most of, let's say, elites, especially politicians, were educated in Russia, a former Soviet Union. Today, the number of students who study abroad in Russia is much less than Vietnamese students who study abroad in America. I was one of them. I study abroad in the US. So there's definitely a shift in terms of like education choice. But in terms of like military, we still have close tie with Russia.
Yeah.
And that's why we still remain neutral in the Ukraine and Russia stand. Yeah, but that kind of create a lot of question and concern from fellow investor community. Korean are asking, you like Filipino investor are asking me about what Vietnam stand and why are you guys doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense from a national security perspective again because of the arms export industry, the political links, the communism, and some of the shared interests in balancing. So I think, just me at least, I think the Russia Vietnam is surprising and not really surprising based
Yeah.
on that history. But like you said, I think the future of Vietnam is very dependent on the investment flows, right? And we talked about it in past episodes. One, of course, like you say, is from America. A lot of it's flowing to the south of Vietnam still for tech, for investment companies. Of course, you said from Chinese capitals also coming in for factories, for infrastructure as well.
Yeah, our neutral stand, we keep our neutral stand, but the common agreement is to attracting further investment to Vietnam. And in the side of US, a lot of corporate, not mostly tech right now, like NVIDIA, SpaceX, are engaging actively with
Right.
Vietnam for further investment, including Apple as well. And yeah, as you mentioned, the Chinese side, we signed an agreement to start the high-speed rail from Vietnam to China.
You mentioned about the bamboo strategy. Can you explain how do people talk about the bamboo strategy?
I think in the press community, people know that we have to use and implement bamboo strategy, meaning having a strong root but very flexible. That's the press community. But I think the business community, most of them don't really understand. So
Yep.
most of them are more worried.
Yeah. I think the bamboo strategy is just that Vietnam is pro-Vietnam, right? Out of all three of them, just like how Singapore is pro-Singapore and Indonesia is pro-Indonesia. I think everybody cares about their own national interests first. And I think it makes sense because Vietnam, you have a shared border with China. In the past, your offshore balance was Russia and Soviet Union. And then now the US is another offshore balance against China. But China provides a lot of the trade and commerce, and I think it's just stay neutral is the strategy for most of Southeast Asia countries right now.
Yeah, I understand their concern as well, because especially for fund manager, I think now politics plays such an important role for the entire fund performance. If the country doesn't handle geopolitical risk, the investment can go to zero. So among the investment professionals, recently in my catch up, the first question is what's going on with Vietnam politics?
It's understandable because a lot of the US denominated funds unfortunately had to pull out of China because of the geopolitics as well, which is
Yeah,
America basically said, hey, we don't want our funds to go to China. We're kind of like decoupling a lot of the links here that allowed the money to flow in. So a lot of withdrawal of FDI, foreign direct investment from China, which has obviously been a huge negative blow to the Chinese economy. But also, like you said, for the VCs and startup founders that were dependent on US dollar funds.
That's why they like split and staying as like different independent entity, which is, I feel lucky. I'm a Vietnam focused fund. So my strategy aligned well with Vietnam politics, staying neutral and focus in Vietnam.
Yeah, it means it's focused on the fundamental GDP growth, the fundamental piece. So I think it's interesting because from a GP perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think regardless of anything, a neutral strategy across all three superpowers is key for Vietnam, like I said, for national security, for political stability, for attracting FDI. So it should translate into real growth. But of course, I think the question for LPs, I can imagine, would be like, am I allowed to keep my money in China? Am I allowed to keep my money in Russia? Am I allowed to keep my money in Vietnam?
A lot of people would have that concern and question. But I think for our position and the neutral stand that Vietnam has, the new president is doing what he's supposed to do, maintain a good relationship with the three superpowers.
I mean, I think everybody in the world who's not a superpower wants to be friends with all the superpowers at some level because nobody really wants them to go into direct conflict, even though there's indirect conflict right now. Because direct conflict is bad for everybody in terms of jobs, in terms of the trade. Even for Singapore as well, technically it signed up as part of sanctions on Russia due to in war. But if you look at the energy, the fuel mixing, I think there were accusations that Singapore is letting Russian oil come into Singapore, right? Which was
Directly or through India?
the reality is that, first of all, oil is oil, right? So oil can be mixed with other oil shipments. And so the provenance of oil is always something that can be moved around dependent on the ship, the tanker, they transfer to each other, they get mixed with each other. So the provenance is always something that has actually some legwork to do. But in general, like the reason why even those Ukraine crisis, even though all that happened and technically Russia oil was supposed to be off the market, none of us really saw a giant oil energy price shift, if you think about it. Like we did see energy prices shift upwards in Europe because they have a lot of Russian gas that was blown up in the Nord Stream pipeline. So they couldn't get that and they also had a sanction. So the energy prices went up, but now it's pretty much stabilized now in Europe. But if you look at Asia, energy prices didn't really go up. And the reason why it didn't go up is because Russian oil was still part of the market. And it's just not being labeled as Russian oil. But at the end of the day, the total supply didn't shift for Asia because we talk about the Vietnam power crisis, which is they want to buy, they need to burn more coal
coal.
because it needs more energy. So everybody in Southeast Asia needs more energy. So there's very little interest in Southeast Asia to cut out Russian oil as a supply.
Yeah, and that's why Russian economy is still relatively strong despite of all the sanction and embargo.
Yeah, so there's a lot of Russian oil flowing through the Straits of Malacca, through Southeast Asia, into Indonesia, into China, and then all those tankers go through Singapore as well. So it's still happening to some extent. I think that a lot of Southeast Asian countries are all neutral, but might be a bit more one way, a bit more the other way, but still relatively neutral, I'd say. I think it's interesting as well because one of the big things that happened in Vietnam, that was similar because of this superpower like decoupling, is the data security laws. Vietnam requires like local data to be stored.
Yeah, it's still being in the decree phase, not the constitution yet, but most of big tech that have cloud presence in Vietnam, like the biggest two, Amazon and Google Cloud, they're all preparing to have a data storage center in Vietnam. And their competitor, Alibaba, also announced that they're gonna invest and open data cloud center in Vietnam.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because I think there's two parts, right? One is requiring data sovereignty, right? So requiring
yeah.
local data of local people, local server, which I think is becoming more popular. I think China was the first to really do it, I would say, because of the part of the China firewall strategy. And then after that, I think America's, I think, replicate some of those requirements for sensitive data. And I think there's also boosted a lot of demand for local servers. And I think it just came out today that Vietnam is now going to allow 100% foreign ownership in data centers because Vietnam normally has a 49% foreign ownership cap in businesses, but doesn't work for data centers because you need majority control of your data, and also you need the majority control of the sovereignty. So
I think it's a positive news.
Yeah.
It's a positive news welcoming big tech further investment. And honestly, all of these companies are prepared. Amazon, when I asked them, they already working on the new data centers. Cloud, when I asked them last year, they did not give me a specific answer, but something is coming on the way. So it's not like they don't have any preparation. And the Google team, most of the account manager, the sales team being moved from Singapore to Vietnam. So Vietnam will have Google office end of this year in Ho Chi Minh City.
Yeah, I think it makes all the sense. The net effect is if you have some kind of like data sovereignty requirement, it's a bit of a soft border, then you create domestic substitution. So now you're allowing foreign direct investment to fulfill that domestic demand. Of course, I think the cost of data will rise for the average Vietnamese consumer because it's always cheaper to run it large scale, larger facilities. But it does create jobs and it does create some data sovereignty for Vietnam. But I think this goes back to the thing where every country is trying to become more sovereign on the data, more local data centers. It's going to be quite interesting to deal with.
And we have local solution as well. VNG has
Yeah.
like their own data solutions, cloud solutions, other like domestic data center as well, like CMC, Viettel.
Yeah. I think Singapore has its own issues because Singapore actually was in a good position because years ago, it was actually number one in data center storage. But there was a moratorium on data centers of building new capacity because of the power situation. So the issue is that Singapore, first of all, we have a certain power, and actually power is relatively cheap in Singapore because so much oil and gas goes through Singapore, right? So they're actually cheap. But the problem is that there's also a requirement that to have a net zero pledge because Singapore is an island, so it wants to be a leader. And it's actually quite expensive to have net zero energy market. And basically with the data center growth, it was basically impossible to hit it net zero with the current energy mix of Singapore. As a result, they put a moratorium on new data centers, which is, I think some people say is to Singapore's loss, obviously, because Singapore has a lot of other benefits of running data centers because all the internet cables go through Singapore. You have a good quality of life for the engineers who are working on data centers. There's also a very good stack. But because of this power issue, and also because to some extent the space issue as well, so Singapore doesn't have enough space for data centers, land. So that moratorium kicked in. So now a lot of them actually going to Johor now, actually.
Yeah.
So data centers. So what's happening is your Johor is like building a lot of data center storage. Malaysia also has relatively cheap energy because they have domestic oil production as well. They have a lot of land. And then a lot of the engineers are living in Singapore and then they just commute to Johor to do the data center visits. So that's like the weird Singapore, Malaysia, Johor collaboration to get these data centers out.
Talk about net zero. Do you see any new startups or interesting company tackling Singapore or Vietnam?
I mean, I think Singapore's, if you look at the energy mix, obviously there's no hydropower because there's no river.
That's Vietnam.
Vietnam can
That's
get to do
Vietnam.
it. There's no geothermal really in Singapore yet. We'll talk about it, but no. So only is really solar. Obviously, the current mix of like oil and gas is very cheap for Singapore. Singapore doesn't really use coal, and it's negligible from my understanding. If I'm wrong, I'm just going to put a giant like sticker to put it there. But I think what's interesting is that Singapore is starting to set up a nuclear safety research arm. So several hundred scientists and engineers to work on nuclear safety. But I think to me, what the writing on the wall from my perspective is, it's pretty hard for Singapore to hit net zero without nuclear power. I think it's doable if you believe certain things about solar cells and battery and all that other stuff. But I think the only way for Singapore to be able to use a lot more energy for all its requirements and hit net zero, I think would require potentially some nuclear power, which is why I think is that the Singapore is setting up these research labs on what they call nuclear safety. Yeah. But of course, you don't need nuclear safety unless you're going to want to do nuclear eventually. So I think the government has previously in the past floated the idea of a nuclear power plant on one of the offshore Singapore islands, so a little bit further away. But I think the classic nuclear power plant, people are concerned about the safety profile, the radiation risk, and so forth. But of course, with the new modular reactors that are happening out there, they're supposed to be safer, they're supposed to automatically shut down, smaller, better safety profile. So supposedly those could fit. So that's like the high level conversations that the government has speculated about through think tanks and so forth. But for sure, the new labs have been created to hire hundreds of engineers to explore nuclear safety. So to me, I think it's a stepping stone. Yeah, I just think that the issue is fundamentally for Asia is that everybody wants to burn 10 times more energy than they currently use today per capita. You know what I mean? So net zero, I think you can go to net zero if you say everybody is allowed to use the same amount of energy today. We cap it and then we switch it to green energy. I think it's more doable. But right now, all the green energy that goes up is not sufficient to fill up the requirements, right? And so you saw that for Singapore, right? Like the moratorium on data centers, a lot of people are not happy about it. Because, yeah, we help a net zero pledge, but now the data center capacity is going to other people, other jobs, other FDI. Yeah.
With a lot of FDI in the pipeline, I think we have to relying on traditional energy sources. Like you say, renewable energy, they're on the way.
I can't imagine because you put in $1 million of FDI, obviously setting up a factory or services industry or whatever. You still need energy anyway.
And actually, energy is like the biggest factor for one of the biggest factor, of course, not the big for them to stay or go to another country.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, because cost of labor, power, and it's
Yeah.
like land, but it's pretty much
Yeah.
all of it. Yeah.
We lost couple one to Malaysia and Indonesia, but those corporate are still pending on like conversation in Vietnam. But like in the immediate terms, we already see that the corporates are walking away to Malaysia and Indonesia due to more reliable energy and infrastructure.
Yeah. Yeah. I think if you don't deliver energy infrastructure, people are like, no matter how popular it is, people are just going to be like, let's diversify. So it's a shame. And yeah, I think Malaysia has been doing a good job. They don't have any power industry issues in terms of the volatility because they have Petronas, which is the domestic oil production. And then domestic oil energy distribution is still okay. So they don't have the energy issue.
And they can also do refinement.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Yeah. And then also Singapore and Malaysia also have that joint capacity. So so that combination is stronger as well than just Malaysia alone or Singapore. So yeah, I think energy is a big piece for the war for FDI. Actually, circling back, I was curious about this 49% ownership requirement. What's the history behind that?
I don't know exactly the history, but it's always the case. Are you familiar with Chinese foreign ownership?
Yeah.
I think it's we just follow what the Chinese law saying.
Yeah. I think, doesn't that make it quite difficult for some FDI, I guess, because you can't own banks or telcos in Vietnam. I can imagine there's a lot of FDI that would be happy to come in.
But actually, the ownership restriction only apply to certain industry. Like bank is very sensitive.
Yeah.
I think Korea also had the same rule, same law. I was reading a deal. Korea Financial Bank got bought by an American private equity back in 1997.
Yeah.
When they had the financial crisis, Asian financial crisis. But still, the negotiation was painful. Korea did not want to sacrifice, the private bank, which has a lot of bad debt. I think we also in the same boat. It's a lot of like national security. So industry like banking, financial service are still highly protected by the government. But if you want to invest in consumption, economy, food and beverage, there's no such thing as foreign ownership restriction.
Yeah, makes sense.
Education, there's none.
Yeah. I think the Saigon Bank issue is resolved, right? I haven't heard any more news about it.
Yeah, no more news.
So it's done. Resolved.
I'm not sure it's exactly resolved, but there has been a lot of overseas banking community visit Vietnam recently. And I cannot tell exactly who, but they all agree that this is the best time to invest in Vietnam. All the monopoly power is technically gone and the whole system is being cleaned up and valuation is more attractive than ever. So this foreign community, they have so much cash and they want to build a bigger presence in Vietnam.
Right.
So they're all very excited. And it's not just banking that they want to buy and invest.
Yeah.
They want to do electric vehicle, food and beverage, manufacturing.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
I think it makes sense. I mean, if you are foreign banking, you can own up to 40%, 49% of a domestic bank. If Vietnam continues growing its GDP growth of 7%, there's a lot of financing needs that need to be done. Previously, all this was bad debt that was hard to see, hard to account for, hard to audit, hard to transact with. So now it's all cleaned up, like you said. And also the government will be happy for you to provide some liquidity
Yeah,
as well,
yeah,
because
yeah.
otherwise the government can't print more money to support it.
Yeah. So split opinion from the foreign investor community. One group is very like concerned about the politics and policy among the three power parties,
Yeah.
and the other group is like so excited that now they can finally get in for
Yeah,
cheaper.
yeah, exactly. And then also everything's cleaned up. And then now they're helping the government because helping
Yeah,
the
yeah.
government clean up. And also part of that, the policy will be like, we will modernize the practices, bring
Yeah.
best practices, all these other stuff. Yeah.
But overall, all of them are, both of the groups are super bullish on the long-term growth and potential.
Yeah, I think what's interesting in reflection is like, because we're always talking every month about Vietnam is, the stuff that happens every month is both good news and bad news, but underlying it is like 7% annual economic growth, right?
Oh, yeah,
And that's
yeah.
the target. So it's great to see that Vietnam is on track to beat the annual forecast. So how does that showing up in your portfolio?
Yeah, it's actually very interesting that most of my portfolio companies still growing very consistently. The founders don't just overpromise; they actually achieving the growth target. Some of them even exceeded it because they won some huge B2B contracts, and that leapfrogged the growth. So I can see the economy, the growth of the whole country reflects in very small startups, but growing fastly despite of the unfavorable kind of market condition in financial market. Still quite illiquid in Vietnam right now.
When you think about all of that, which sectors do you think are performing better? So is the consumer performing better, healthcare performing better? Is there any differentiation in that growth rates?
Yes, consumer, healthcare, education.
Those are top three. I
Yeah.
mean, education continues to be popular in Vietnam.
Yeah, like I mentioned, they'll continue to invest in themselves. Now, not only parents invest in their family, but also employers invest in them. Yeah,
Makes a lot of sense.
really reflect that in the performance.
I think education continues to be a no-brainer for Vietnam in terms of investment vertical and growth vertical intrinsically. Then consumer, of course, makes sense as well. But
Yeah.
let's double click consumer. So you mean like consumer discretionary, like bubble tea and pizza? Or do you mean like consumer luxury, like premium goods? How do you think about it?
Not so much in luxury.
Yeah.
I don't really invest in luxury premium
Yeah.
segment, but more mass market
Yeah.
or like affordable luxury. And I also encourage and have the conversation with the founders in Vietnam that, hey, maybe it's time that we start going global. So we have this conversation for the past like 3-4 months. And now some of them are ready and some of them are getting there. Because looking back in the past 2 years, if we can have stable revenue from both domestic and international perform like better over comparing to other startups in the region. So yeah, some of my portfolios are already listed on the US. So consumer in the US can also buy their product.
Yeah. And then you mentioned healthcare. What's the story behind Vietnamese healthcare? What is the Vietnamese healthcare system anyway? So is it public? Is it private? How does it work?
So traditionally we rely on public healthcare system, but as the population grow and as the expectation and quality of life improve, the public infrastructure is not enough to meet demand for the population. So recently, most of the investment coming from private equity is to expanding the private healthcare system, like mostly hospital. And VC has been active, but not as major as private equity. We have smaller ticket size. Doesn't make sense for us to buy a hospital. But private equity, pretty much all the big names all have at least one hospital investment in Vietnam. Because if you look at number of doctor per 100 people, I think Vietnam has a lower ratio comparing to neighboring countries. So we have lower than Singapore, of course, but we also have lower than like Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia. So the public infrastructure is being overloaded because people have like better quality of life and higher expectation with their healthcare. So the private hospital and healthcare play are getting more and more investment and attention from the investor community.
I think when you say those three things, it makes very natural sense to me because I think that story is also replicated in many ways. Education is not consistent everywhere, actually. So I was going to talk about Indonesia or Thailand or Philippines, and I would say education is not necessarily as strong, but it's one of those categories as people spend more money and have more money, they want to invest in their kids. So obviously that's one. Obviously consumers doing well in Indonesia and Thailand, Philippines. And of course, healthcare is something that's also, I think, very subject to the local public policy, whether they allow that private investment. Are there any sectors that you're like, not so hot these days? I mean, Vietnam used to be very hot for Web3 and gaming, for example, and fintech as well. How do you see that happening?
In terms of web, I think a bit slower on the gaming activity, gaming investment, but other founders are still building on like infrastructure or like exchange in Web3, but maybe they don't really pitch that they are a Vietnamese company.
Okay. So was this a global company?
Global company, but actually 90% of the team,
Yeah.
including Deb, are in Vietnam,
Yeah.
and even the founders are Vietnamese. So that's the case for Axie Infinity. So Web3 activity are still very active, I would say, but they don't really necessarily brand that they are Vietnamese company
Yeah.
anymore. Fintech activity, I think, got a bit slower for Vietnam.
I mean, it interacts with the things we talked about, the Saigon Bank as well
Yeah.
and everything. I feel like that issue created an opportunity for large banks to come in to
Yeah.
recapitalize all of the other banks and increase best practices. So I think there's opportunity at top end of the finance sector. But it doesn't feel like there's, for example, more open APIs, banking APIs, more opening of financial regulation for smaller fintechs. I don't know. Is that
Yeah,
fair assessment?
you are correct on that. So the established banks with like proper license, proper charter of capital are doing super well.
Yeah.
And that reflect like how the health of the economy is, because the top bank, VP Bank, they have been achieving record-breaking profit. I mean, the economy is like doing really well.
Yeah.
But the lower, smaller guys like
Yeah.
fintech startups with no license, with no affordable cost of capital, no cash, are a bit more struggling.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there's no open
I think that's the big important part is there's no open sandbox, right?
No.
Politically or regulatorily for the finance. So I think that's one of the big struggles is I think a lot of people who are in Southeast Asia doing fintech felt like America, fintech is great. Europe, fintech's great because of a high GDP per capita and very stodgy incumbents. So they want to bring that to Asia. But then I think Southeast Asia, I think the regulatory piece is one problem. And then the other piece is that the GDP per capita is small. So the amount of disposable income to deposit or invest is actually quite low, actually.
Yeah. The biggest roadblock for Vietnam is sandbox policy.
I mean, Singapore has a very strong sandbox piece, but the problem is that the domestic market is very competitive. That's one. And then two, of course, the market is not very large. It's 6 million Singaporeans. So it's like a fraction of the size. I think Indonesia, fintech still seems to be doing relatively well. Because I think, look at it, it's a 300 billion market and the financial feels a little bit more open regulatory wise.
Yeah, so I would agree that
Yeah.
fintech in Vietnam is a bit more
Struggling right now. I mean, things maybe change next year or new policies or whatever it is. I think it's interesting because if you asked me 2 years ago, I'll say everybody was very excited about Vietnamese fintech, right? At the VC side. So we're looking so many startup founders, so much VC interest. And then now it's 3 years down the road. It's,
Yeah.
the people benefiting the most are the big banks that can recapitalize
They
properly.
don't even have to be big bank. They
Yeah.
can just be medium size
Yeah.
or small, but have license.
Yeah. Actually, that's an interesting one. I think one thing I've seen more in Southeast Asia over the past 1 year is startups that are trying to acquire small banks to get that license. So basically they're saying like, okay, we can't play in a sandbox, but we have to acquire a small bank to get a license. And then we will apply our tools, we won't sell our tools to banks to increase the productivity. We will sell the tools to ourselves to increase our own productivity, which is basically becoming a challenger bank.
Yeah, but that's only apply if you raise up to Series D. Vietnam, we don't have that many fintech players who raise up to Series D.
Yeah. So I think I've definitely seen a lot of decks in Southeast Asia where people are like, they want to raise a very large amount of money to buy out the bank.
Yeah.
Obviously, the founders are not fresh graduates, undergraduates who are putting together a UX. These folks are normally like banking leaders already. They have some family support. They have some of the right people. So that's another approach I've seen happen.
Yeah. I guess like after the acquisition, how can you make sure that that license is actually going to be helpful?
Yeah. The problem is that you're just still competing with other banks, right? So now you're like,
Yeah.
because you normally buy at the smallest possible bank and then you still have maybe like 1% market share and you still have to compete with everybody. So it doesn't really look like a VC outcome for that asset class, but it's a good set of money for private equity, family offices to invest.
Yeah. So I would say it's maybe sometimes it's a blessing in disguise that
Yeah.
you didn't buy the license, because maybe after you bought the license, the market went bad and nobody invest anymore, and there's no liquidity volume trading in the market. So bought the license and then the market crashed.
Yeah.
So if you didn't buy the bank or license, maybe it's a good,
Yeah.
at least for Vietnam market.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're talking about like the traditional retail banking, your consumer, direct to consumer finance, maybe to some extent consumer loans as well. But of course, I know everyone's very hot for earned wage access these days. Still going strong?
I think so. I think there's still, especially like farmer financing, that space is still getting some attention and investment.
I guess earned wage access, I mean, the beauty of it supposedly is that it's secured financing, right? So we have a collateral, which is your next month's salary from the company. And then we lend it to you today. So it's supposed to be highly secure financing.
Not necessary.
Yeah.
What if the company bankrupts next
Yeah.
month? How do you know? How do you do
Yeah.
due diligence on the company? You are not their investor. You can
Yeah.
ask for the full financial picture.
True.
You just come in to provide a financial wellness solution for their employees. You're not able to see their entire balance sheet.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe I drank too much EWA, Honda Kool-Aid, through all the
Yeah.
pictures of, oh, it's so secure. It's not. I mean, there's a big part is like, look out for your non-performing loans and your net interest rate margin.
Yeah, could be potential, but you have to see the balance sheet of the company.
Yeah. Okay. On that note, I'd love to summarize the 3 big takeaways. I think, first of all, thanks so much for sharing Vietnam's bamboo strategy in the context of the Putin visit, the Xi Jinping visit, as well as the Biden visit. So balancing out the national security concerns versus kind of territorial concerns versus the infrastructure and direct investment requirements. Secondly, thanks for sharing about the data sovereignty requirements of Vietnam, as well as the foreign ownership requirements, which tie to each other as well. And lastly, thanks for sharing about your point of view on the Vietnamese investment landscape across all the consumer, healthcare, fintech, as well as education. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.